This film is based on research in the Longyear Museum and other historical archives. These accounts of some early Christian scientists whose stories link together come from letters and other records of Janet Coleman, Elizabeth Buswell, the Farlow family, Mary Armstrong, James Neal, and Willis and Mary Gross. The first of these stories comes from a reminiscence by Cora Hinchliffe Lindsay. The physical healing of Christian Science results now, as in Jesus' time, from the operation of divine principle, before which sin and disease lose their reality in human consciousness and disappear as naturally and as necessarily as darkness gives place to light and sin to reformation. Mary Baker Eddy.
In 1888, in a prairie town west of Wichita, Kansas, 10-year-old Jimmy King, the son of a veterinarian, came down with symptoms of the dreaded typhoid fever. The previous year, Jimmy's mother had been healed of a serious illness by a neighbor who was a Christian Scientist. With Jimmy growing worse by the hour, the Kings sent for the same neighbor, William D. Hinchliffe, to heal their son. W.D., as he was called by his friends, was a husky frontier farmer, strong as an ox. Strongest man in the county, neighbors called him. W.D. and his wife, Bertha, had found this healing religion barely 2 years earlier. According to their daughter, Cora, as soon as the Hinchliffes got the call for help, they left their farm and set out over the 5 miles of dirt road to town. At the King's home, W.D. prayed for the boy's recovery, just as he had in other cases recently, using what he had learned from the Christian Science textbook, Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures. News about the typhoid case and the Christian Scientists raced around town. Outside the King's house, neighbors gathered in the night, troubled about what was going on inside. At one point, they took it upon themselves to call for a medical doctor. But when the doctor heard it was typhoid fever, he said the boy would die anyway, and he refused to come. Preachers in the area had been denouncing Christian Science, condemning it as the work of the devil. The group outside the home were of that mind. They believed the Christian Science cure being practiced by W.D. Hinchliffe would send the boy's soul to hell. Some argued that the way to stop this Christian Scientist was to show him they meant to hang him. In the middle of the night, a group of them went to the hardware store and made the owner open up so they could purchase a rope. Back at the Kings, they waited in the dark, peering through the window, with the rope ready for a lynching if and when Jimmy died. Sometime during the night, Mrs. King stepped outside. The people outdoors demanded to know how her son was doing and what was being done to him. Mrs. King fended them off and shut the door. She never warned the Hinchliffes what was going on in the yard. Her greatest worry was that they would be frightened and stop praying. Perhaps she needn't have worried about that. These two new Christian Scientists were prairie pioneers and made of tougher stuff than would be easily scared off. The Hinchliffes worked through the night, and as the sun rose, the boy's fever broke. He dozed off into a normal sleep, and the household and the town calmed down. The couple wouldn't learn until days later the danger they'd been in. But there's no indication that they would have been deterred for a moment from their healing work, even had they known about the murderous hostility outside the window. To the contrary, W.D. and Bertha Hinchliffe went right on spreading Christian Science through healing and regeneration in frontier towns of Kansas and Oklahoma. Where did such a man and woman come from?
They came from and were living links in a chain of healing, reaching back to one lone woman at work half a continent away in Boston, Massachusetts, Mary Baker Eddy. The Hinchliffes of Kansas and thousands of others were learning from Mrs. Eddy's textbook and from the growing circle of students going out from her classes in the 1880s to teach and heal. What active pupils like these meant to Mrs. Eddy is expressed in her message to members of Second Church of Christ Scientist, New York City. May the benediction of well done, good and faithful, rest worthily on the builders of this beautiful temple, and the glory of the resurrection morn burst upon the spiritual sense of this people with renewed vision, infinite meanings, endless hopes, and glad victories in the onward and upward chain of being.
This chain of stories links some of the Christian Science pioneers in the Midwest. It begins in the East, in a suburb close by Boston with a young couple, Janet and Irwin Coleman of Alston. Sometime after their marriage in 1876, 27-year-old Janet Coleman had become ill. By late 1882, the illness had become chronic. In her words,
"For 5 years I had been an invalid suffering from many claims. Drugs and treatment of all kinds failed to help me. I had no relief. 2 of my husband's aunts were having treatment from a Mrs. Childs of Somerville. I said I would like to have treatment also. Janet Coleman."
Irwin Coleman knew little more than that his aunts were having mental treatments involving something called Christian Science. In some quarters it was being called the Boston craze. Irwin objected to trying it. No quack cures for his wife. Janet persisted.
I kept saying that I heard that people were healed, and I wanted to be healed.
In November, Janet paid a visit to Cynthia Childs in East Cambridge, a Christian Science healer, as practitioners were often called at that time. Mrs. Childs advised her to go straight to the source, in Boston. A few days later, Janet crossed the Charles River to Boston's Back Bay, rode past the new townhouses along Columbus Avenue, located Mrs. Eddy's home, and rang her doorbell. She was invited in. The woman she met had come a long way since 1866, when her own sudden cure through prayer had opened her thought to the discovery of the principle of Christian healing. That experience had launched her into 15 years of moving from place to place in eastern Massachusetts while she practiced healing through prayer, taught others to heal, and wrote and published her textbook, Science and Health. The 1880s found her in Boston, leading the growing religious movement she had named Christian Science, preaching, writing, teaching, chartering the Massachusetts Metaphysical College, and seeking students who would carry the work onward. 1882 had been a dreadful year for the newly widowed Mrs. Eddy. But coming from the ashes and anguish of that year, she and her movement would make immense progress. A significant part of that progress would be the work of the unprepossessing young woman sitting in her parlor that November day, simple, unassuming Janet Coleman. As she listened to Mrs. Eddy, Janet impetuously broke in to say she would like to study with her.
Never before in my life had I been in such an atmosphere of thought. I felt my own shortcomings. I wanted to study with her, but the thought came to me of my own unworthiness, and I told her that I was not good enough. For that very reason, she said, that she would take me as a student.
6 weeks later, in January 1883, Janet was in Mrs. Eddy's classroom.
There were 14 in my class when I studied in 1883 in our leader's back parlor on Columbus Avenue. To look back and see how few in number we were.
Using what she learned in that class, Janet was healed of all the ailments she had been suffering from. She immediately thought of healing others. The first was her mother-in-law, who had a growth on her hand.
It was almost instantaneous. She had a wen on the back of her hand, which had troubled her for a long time. I treated her, and the next day it was entirely gone. We were both delighted.
Barely 3 months after her class, April 1883, the first issue of the New Journal of Christian Science carried Janet Coleman's notice as a Christian Science practitioner. Her name would appear there for the next 37 years. Janet and others in Boston could talk with Mrs. Eddy in weekly students' meetings, where their teacher explained Christian Science treatment through prayer and corrected their misconceptions.
I heard our leader say when she was asked if she did the healing, "No, 1,000 times no. It is the Christ that does the healing." At last she began to tell us that we must go out and teach this truth to others.
Janet's husband, Irwin, became interested in the religion that had healed his wife, and he began to study Christian Science. Later that year, the couple did what many adventurous young Americans in those days were hankering to do. They went west. The American Midwest in the 1880s was a booming but still wild frontier. Rail lines were being laid over open plains. Many towns were little more than railheads or settlements of homesteaders. What one day would become a city might be a sprawling camp of tents or a cluster of corrals surrounded by ranches and open range. In the new towns, a retail store might open for business under canvas. A hotel might front on a dirt street that doubled as a cattle trail. Mrs. Eddy generally advised her students to practice in larger cities. The Colemans set down in Chicago. Then they moved on to Wichita and went out from there to wherever they received a call for healing.
I have seen all manner of diseases expelled through the power of truth and love, and even death give up its false claim of power opposed to God, when the healing power of truth and love was realized.
After a year of work in this field, the Colemans returned to Boston so that Janet could enroll in a class for teaching Christian Science, the normal class, in 1885, only the second to be given at the college. Mrs. Eddy was raising a crop of properly trained Christian Science teachers. Janet Coleman would be one of them.
In one of the towns springing up west of the Missouri River, Beatrice, Nebraska, another couple were about to join this chain of healing, Ezra and Elizabeth Buswell. Ezra was successful as a farmer and lumberyard proprietor, but he, and especially his wife Elizabeth, were racked by ill health. Doctors had suggested that the climate and mineral waters of Colorado might relieve her suffering, and in the summer of 1884, they visited the mountain state. Elizabeth had to return home on a stretcher, and for 3 painful months had to be turned in bed. A friend, just returned from Boston, told them she had been healed there by something called Christian Science. Ezra urged his wife to try the new religious cure. They searched for a Christian Science practitioner. Just 6 years later, some 300 practitioners would be listed in the Christian Science Journal. But in 1884, there were only a handful, mostly in the East. Elizabeth could not be moved that far. Then they learned about someone closer to home. Jenny Fenn of nearby Omaha, Nebraska, had taken the first of her 4 courses with Mrs. Eddy in March that year. 2 months later, Mrs. Fenn had launched into her healing practice. In time, she would build a long list of successful healings. Elizabeth went off to Omaha, accompanied by a friend who was also in ill health. Neither knew quite what to expect. 3 days later, both women returned, healed. For years, Elizabeth had tried every medical treatment that promised help, but had steadily grown worse. Now, in a matter of days, she was perfectly well. Ezra, his hope aroused, bought a copy of Science and Health and studied it. Within a short time, he was healed of the chronic kidney trouble he had endured for years. The Buswells spread the word about their healings to friends and neighbors. During the summer and fall, interest grew. Soon they and the many newcomers felt that they needed a class with a qualified instructor, and they contacted Jenny Fenn. Mrs. Fenn sent word to Boston about the rapid progress. Her message requested the college to send the Buswells' eager group a teacher.
In October, in answer to that call, Janet Coleman was on her way west to Omaha. She was traveling alone. Irwin had stayed in Boston for his own primary class with Mrs. Eddy. Then he planned to join his wife in the work out west. Janet boarded the trains, heedless of the fact that she was expecting her first child.
I never thought of fear. I asked Mrs. Eddy if I should go, and with her permission, I went.
She faced a grueling 1,200-mile train trip with many changes. Across New York, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, across the Mississippi toward the wide plains and big sky of Nebraska. After days of travel, Janet reached Omaha, only to learn that the class would be in the Buswells' hometown 7 hours further along. Janet pushed on. In Beatrice, she held the first Christian Science class to be taught west of the Missouri River. There were 8 students. Then she went back to Omaha to await the birth. At that point, something occurred that might have ended Janet Coleman's mission and indeed her life. Well before her time for delivery, she collapsed and lost consciousness. The doctor Janet had chosen to assist at delivery was summoned, and he performed emergency surgery. The operation went badly. Janet was severely injured and had not regained consciousness. The doctor had no hope for her recovery. The premature baby had not survived. Janet tells what happened next.
Word was telegraphed to my husband, who was in Alston. He went in to see Mrs. Eddy, telling her what the doctor said, that I was unconscious. She answered him with these few words: "There is no unconscious mind." Mrs. Eddy left him and went into her room and shut the door.
Mrs. Eddy herself recalled telling Irwin his wife would recover and he could finish the class. Irwin, however, felt he should immediately go to his wife.
He took the train at once, and in 3 days, he was with me. The night before, one of my students had been told by the doctor that I could not live but a few hours. She might as well go home. When she came the next morning, she heard me singing hymns with my husband. Our leader made the demonstration for me that one with God is a majority.
But joy cometh in the morning.
She wrote Mrs. Eddy,
The doctors cannot get over it. They never knew of anyone recovering from what I had. I feel so sorry to have lost my little baby girl. They tell me it was such a cunning baby. But I don't feel I should murmur after all the blessings I have received.
5 years later, Janet would give birth to their daughter, Ruth Eddy Coleman. But there were miles to go before that happy event.
Just 2 weeks after her crisis, the Colemans, undaunted, were en route back to Boston, Janet feeling stronger with every mile to continue their work. Irwin Coleman enrolled in Mrs. Eddy's next primary class to finish the study he had broken off to be with his wife. A scant few months later, May 1886, the couple set out again on an arduous 4-year missionary adventure in the mushrooming towns and cities of the American West. Often, in the face of hostility, skepticism, and even physical and legal threats, they and a growing chain of Janet's students joined in pioneering the Christian Science movement. Among them, Ezra and Elizabeth Buswell continued their work, healing, teaching, and helping form church groups in Beatrice and other Midwestern towns. Mrs. Eddy might well have been thinking of such frontier spirit when she wrote of her textbook. It is the task of the sturdy pioneer to hew the tall oak and to cut the rough granite. Future ages must declare what the pioneer has accomplished.
They were a tight-knit band, the Farlows of Beatrice, Nebraska. In fact, they were a band. There was Alfred, the oldest, on tuba, brothers Will and George on cornet, sisters Sarah and Stella on tenor horn, Emma and Mary on baritone horn, and little Maggie on drum. All led by their dad, William, who, in addition to being a farmer, store proprietor, and local official, was a music teacher. The Farlows had moved to Nebraska from Illinois after their dad's failed business venture forced Alfred to leave college, and all the Farlows had to pitch in to support the family. Alfred and his brother Will, in the entrepreneurial spirit of the time, started a factory to convert local reeds into brooms. Finding no orchestra in the frontier town, the music-loving family started their own.
The Farlow family band was the general favorite. Their open-air concert from the veranda of the lodge building was a rare musical treat.
When the Farlows discovered Christian Science, they did it the same way they did everything else, as a family. According to Will Farlow's daughter, Dorothy,
a neighbor who was practically a confirmed invalid and who had tried almost every conceivable kind of treatment and medicine suddenly left town. She remained away for several weeks. When she returned, she was almost a well woman. Dorothy Farlow.
The neighbor had brought from Omaha a copy of Science and Health, which was then in 2 volumes. The idea of Christian healing through prayer vitally interested Mother Farlow, and she brought one of the volumes home for her family to read. Will Farlow recalled how the book was put in his hands in the days when he and Alfred were running the broom factory.
That day I did as I was in the habit of doing occasionally, swearing off a smoking habit. About 4 o'clock in the evening, I gave up my work and went home, feeling too much overcome by my desire for the weed to do any more work.
Will's mother brought him the volume of Science and Health, telling him this book was supposed to heal those who read it.
Well, in less than a fortnight, all desire for tobacco had left me as free as if I had never used it. Will Farlow.
Alfred was of a somewhat darker frame of mind. He recalled,
I contracted a disease that threatened me with death in a few years. And as most people do under such circumstances, I also contracted a fear of eternal damnation. I had become very unhappy, full of doubts and fears, and skeptical even of the truths of the Bible. the mental darkness increased until I grew desperate. Alfred Farlow.
At that point, the Christian Scientist in Omaha who had treated the Farlows' neighbor moved to a house next door to the Farlows. At his mother's suggestion, Alfred went to her for help.
I placed myself under treatment, but I found it, at first, hard to understand. One day, driving across the western prairie, in company with my friends who were discussing the question, I saw for the first time the idea of divine science, that man is, not shall be, God's own likeness, forever saved, and that only a seeming darkness hides that fact. The change for which I had labored had come.
With Alfred's healing, the entire Farlow family seized on Christian Science.
Our whole family took up its study together. Father, mother, and 8 children. We gathered around the dining room table in the evenings, the only table large enough for the whole family to gather around, to study the new religion.
As they studied Mrs. Eddy's book, the Farlows learned that a Christian Scientist who had been taught by Mrs. Eddy would be holding classes in their town. Janet Coleman and her husband were on their return trip to the Midwest to heal and teach. In May 1886, her class in Beatrice contained 4 Farlows: Alfred, Sarah, Emma, and Will. After 7 lessons, Mrs. Coleman told her students to go out, find a patient, and test their understanding. Will Farlow's young neighbor had a severe gash over his eye caused by a flying wood chip. Will asked him if he might help him through prayer.
He looked at me rather incredulously and said that I might. The next day I hunted him up, and when I asked him about his wound, he put his hand up to his eye and found there was not even a mark left. He had completely forgotten about it. The happiness and peace that I experienced, I had never had before.
A man from Illinois recalled that during this period, Alfred treated his father for consumption.
My father had lost his mother, a brother, and 2 sisters with consumption. He found himself going the same way. Alfred come back to his old neighborhood in Illinois to visit and spread the good news around. The healing, when it came, was instantaneous. The consumption fell off him like an outworn garment. T.V. Anderson.
The Farlows went ahead with their Christian Science practice in the face of opposition and disdain from others, including a worker at their own broom factory who quit in protest. As Will tells it,
He came back in about 2 years with a severe fever, and I had the pleasure of healing him through my understanding of Christian Science, for I had, in the meantime, taken a course of instructions from our beloved teacher, Mrs. Eddy.
1 year after their class with Janet Coleman, at her urging, Alfred and Will had gone to Boston for Mrs. Eddy's primary class. 2 years later, 1889, the last primary class she would teach at the college was also the largest. 4 Farlows, Alfred, Sarah, Will, and Emma, were among the nearly 70 students. Mrs. Eddy told them all, "We today in this classroom are enough to convert the world if we are of one mind. You are going out to demonstrate a living faith, a true sense of the infinite good, a sense that does not limit God, but brings to human view an enlarged sense of deity."
The Farlow family were among those rising to this formidable challenge. Alfred and Will closed their broom factory and launched full-time into the practice of Christian Science healing. Soon they moved to Topeka and formed the Kansas Christian Science Institute. Alfred began writing letters to news editors answering attacks on Christian Science. Jumping aboard the modern mode of rail travel, the Farlow brothers went on the road to pioneer towns, lecturing to audiences large and small. In some places, Alfred held public debates on Christian Science, responding to criticisms by clergymen or physicians. Will traveled from hotel to hotel in town after town, advertising informal talks about Christian Science in rented hotel parlors. Dorothy Farlow recalled her father's parlor talks.
There were times when only 1 or 2 people came, other times 9 or 10, and numerous times there were so many he would arrange for the use of the schoolhouse or town hall.
Healings followed in the wake of these travels. Will put up a notice for one of his talks in the post office of a town where he was staying. A customer looked it over skeptically, then went up to Will and demanded, "Can your Christian Science heal this?" pointing to his own crippled arm. As Dorothy tells it,
My father assured him it could, whereupon the man replied, "All right, you pray for me, and if you heal my arm, I'll come and hear you talk." The man seemed more belligerent and defiant than seeking, but my father decided he had been asked for a treatment, and he would give it.
that evening, as Will got up to speak, the man from the post office strode in, grabbed Will's hand, and pumped it up and down vigorously, thanking him. He was using the same arm that had been limp and useless that morning.
Due to work like this by the Farlow brothers and a growing number of others, Christian Science groups and churches were springing up all over the American West. In 1895, the older Farlow brothers moved their practice to Kansas City. Naturally, the entire Farlow family moved with them. Together, they helped found Kansas City Mission Church, with Alfred as pastor and just 17 members, most of whom were Farlows. And naturally, being mainly Farlows, those 17 voices made music. In less than a year, by all reports, the voices of Kansas City Mission Church grew to over 500.
There was a spirit in the people who were building the American Midwest in the 1870s and 80s.
I was never born a coward and learned in my early childhood to attend to my own affairs and never bother other people's business, but always do good by everybody, and God would love me. Mary Perrin Armstrong.
On November 6, 1878, Mary Perrin married a suitor who was deeply in love with her, Joseph Armstrong of Carrollton, Illinois. The couple left immediately for Iowa, looking forward to a life of growing prosperity on the frontier. Within 10 years, their lives would be utterly changed from what they expected at that moment. After settling his father's estate, involving thousands of acres of land holdings, Joseph and his wife moved to Irving, Kansas. Joseph launched into a career of business development, real estate, lumber and building materials, raising thoroughbred stock, erecting an opera house, and finally founding a bank, the Armstrong Bank. He was a success at everything. Mary recalled his ambition at that time.
To be a banker had been his one ambition, and after he obtained his desire, money-making became a fixed fact for him. He saw the possibilities of making millions of dollars for himself.
But Joseph's successes were clouded by his wife's failing health. She had sought help from doctors in other cities. Their family physician told them Mary's case was hopeless unless a higher power healed her. Joseph worried for the wife he loved, and the young mother worried for the future of her 2 sons. By 1886, their once golden future looked dark. Then Mary received another blow, word that her beloved mother had died. Mary wrote to an aunt, pouring out her grief for her mother and despair over her own illness. Her aunt's reply would change everything.
I received word from an aunt that her daughter, who had been an invalid for 15 years, had been healed by Christian Science, and I began to take courage that I could be healed. My husband, after reading the letter, urged that I go and visit my aunt and find out about Christian Science. While at my aunt's, I took Christian Science treatment of the practitioner in the town and was healed the third treatment.
Joseph had expected that his wife would be, at best, a little improved. When she wrote him she was well, he was astonished. She sent him Science and Health. He read it, but said he didn't understand it. When his wife returned, she was accompanied by a new practitioner, Fanny Wilkins of Beatrice, Nebraska. Fanny had been a bedridden invalid for some 13 years until she was healed through the work of Jenny Fenn of Omaha. Fanny was on her way back to her home in Beatrice, having just finished a Christian Science class at Knoxville, Illinois. Her teacher was Janet Coleman. The Armstrongs listened to Mrs. Wilkins' explanations, studied the textbook, and tried to apply what they were learning. They soon felt the need for instruction, and a few months later, they were in one of Janet Coleman's classes. Then, in November 1887, the Armstrongs went to Boston for primary class with Mrs. Eddy, returning 2 years later for the normal class.
Soon after completing the normal class, my husband and I gave our entire time to the cause of Christian Science. Our work for the cause in healing the sick and preaching the gospel in the West was fought against on all sides. Still, we pressed on, healing our quota.
One time, while passing through Salina, Kansas, Joseph was locked up 6 weeks in the pest house for smallpox, maliciously, according to his wife.
While confined there, he healed 4 cases of smallpox and forced his release by his manifest evidence of perfect health, coming out untouched by the belief, after undergoing a rigid examination by several doctors. He was successful as a practitioner and teacher, having taught a goodly number of students and having healed a large number of patients. Our demonstrations over the seeming ills of the flesh and material difficulties have been truly wonderful.
The man who had wanted to make millions now only wanted to make people whole and bring the new religion into their lives.
In 1886, when the Armstrong Bank opened with a good deal of fanfare, special notice was made of one of the bank's employees.
J. Armstrong moved into his new bank building Wednesday, and the handsome cashier, James Neal, has a smile for everyone.
Armstrong's personable cashier, 20-year-old James Neal, rented a room in his employer's home. Later that year, when Mary Armstrong returned to Irving, fully healed, accompanied by Fanny Wilkins, Neal joined the Armstrongs for an evening of discussion with her. Mrs. Wilkins handed Neal a Christian Science journal as he was going to his room. He spent several hours reading it. The next morning, his mind was made up. He ordered 12 copies of Science and Health for himself and his family and friends. But even before the books arrived, Neal leaped into testing what he was learning.
I learned enough from talking with the practitioner and reading a single copy of the journal to undertake a case of healing, and healed a brother of Mr. Armstrong who was in a good deal of distress and suffering, James Neal.
Later, after the Armstrongs' class with Mrs. Eddy, they passed along what they had learned to Joseph's star employee. Before the lessons were done, Neal announced he would resign from the bank to enter the Christian Science practice. He told them he just couldn't keep out of it. In 1888, he set out on his new career, blazing a trail of healings wherever he went. In Arkansas City, Kansas, a man who had been totally deaf in one ear for many years had his hearing restored. In Salina, Kansas, a doctor's son who had been totally blind for over 2 years, given up as untreatable, found his sight restored. Neal recalled.
In 12 weeks, he went out with some young men on the prairie hunting prairie chickens and had the best score for shooting of anyone in the party.
A sheep drover came in from Russell, Kansas, 150 miles away, so lame for over a year that he could hardly stand without support.
He was so completely healed that in a short time he went home and wrote back telling me how easy it was to get on his horse and ride all day.
The sheep drover put Neil in touch with a farmer's wife in Russell who had suffered injuries in childbirth. She had been bedridden 7 years and the family was destitute. Neil treated the woman's case through messages sent by mail pouch. A few weeks later, the woman reported that she had felt something snap inside her. She had immediately gotten up and dressed and soon joined in the chores of the farm. After that healing, other patients in Russell began writing to Neil. He took up the case of a woman diagnosed by doctors as having a hopeless cancer. When the problem did not appear to be yielding to absent treatment, Neil boarded a train for Russell to go see her. While he was there, the bedridden woman recovered and walked the half-mile to his hotel 20 or more times. She and her husband went on to work on a large ranch for a number of years. Neil ended up staying in Russell 5 weeks.
When the woman he had corresponded with in Russell had been healed of the after effects of childbirth, Neil expected no payment from the impoverished farm couple, but he gave prayerful thought to their poverty. One day, the woman's husband knocked on his hotel room door, came in, and scooped coins out of his pockets into a pile. In Neil's words,
"There, Mr. Neil," he said, "my wife dug taters all day yesterday, and I brought them into town and sold them in order to be able to pay you something on account."
Neil tried to decline, but the man insisted. In return, Neil presented him a copy of Science and Health to study. The man's fortunes improved to the point that he leased a farm outside Kansas City and sold his produce in town, going door to door. When he heard of an illness in any household, he would not rest until he saw the mistress of the house and told of his wife's healing. Neil found this plain dirt farmer a remarkable missionary.
He interested more of the so-called better class of people and caused them to take up treatment than any person I had known.
A year later, wanting deeper understanding, Neil sought out the Armstrongs' teacher, Janet Coleman, now in Wichita. After his class with her, he set out on the trail again.
Then, in Kearney, Nebraska, James faced what looked like a serious setback. He was charged with violating state law by treating a case without a medical license to practice healing. Undeterred, while awaiting his trial, Neil posted his sign in the lobby of the Midway Hotel and announced in the newspaper that he was staying in Kearney for 6 months and would be available daily to anyone who needed him. The jury acquitted him of all charges, and after the verdict, a member of the jury who had been selected for his hostility to Christian Science called at the hotel to ask Neil to treat him, and also to treat his sister who lived in another town. Both were healed.
So many patients came to see me while there, the chairs had to be put in the hall outside of my reception room to take care of the overflow.
Neil was not alone in all this. By the end of the 1880s, hundreds of Christian Science pioneers would be introducing healing through prayer into the lives of people in all corners of the United States and in many places overseas.
Mrs. Eddy has pointed to the effect of such activity. Today there is hardly a city, village, or hamlet in which are not to be found living witnesses and monuments to the virtue and power of truth as applied through this Christian system of healing disease. In 1889, with Janet Coleman's recommendation, James was admitted to the last primary class Mrs. Eddy would teach at the college in Boston. Then he returned to the Midwest. Like his colleagues spreading out to those cities, villages, and hamlets around the world, young Mr. Neil was just getting started.
In 1886, a Christian scientist, perhaps Alfred Farlow, had come to Knoxville and had begun treating the sick. As always, that brought antagonism. But he held meetings in private homes, and the number of townspeople came to hear about the religion that healed. Mary Epley was one of them.
It was clear to me that the scientist manifested more love and more of the Spirit of Christ than did those who sought to oppose him. I loved Christian Science from the time I first heard of it. Mary Eddy.
Mary was all of 22 years old. Her staunchly religious family were against Christian Science as they understood it, and they gave her a hard time over her new faith. Friends she loved turned against her. But the young woman held firm for what she now believed.
Willis Gross, like Mary, was the offspring of devout parents who had taught him to love Orthodox Christianity. And, like Mary, he was just 22 years old when he first heard about the new religion.
A former schoolmate who had found help in Christian Science after he had exhausted the skill of many physicians returned to Knoxville. My friend introduced the subject of Christian Science by handing me an open Bible. As I read, I was impressed by the words, "And these signs shall follow them that believe. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." Willis Gross.
At first, Willis found the new teaching too contrary to what he had been taught, and he argued many points. But his curiosity aroused, he read Science and Health. In September, Janet Coleman arrived in Knoxville. Willis took her class and immediately decided to give up the study of law for the study of the Christian Science textbook.
Science and Health appealed to me as the most logical, consistent, and practical work I had ever read.
A month later, he answered a call for help at Aledo, Illinois, and for the next year devoted all his time to healing in Aledo and neighboring towns, including one patient in Keithsburg who had been ill for 20 years.
Mary Eddy entered Janet Coleman's next class in the spring of 1887, and then looked for a place to do some good. Mary and Willis had become friends, and he may have mentioned Keithsburg to her as a place in need. Mary had never been to the town and knew no one there, but she went.
If ever anyone went out alone with God, I surely did. I had been in the town but 2 days when I was asked to treat the banker of the place. He was helped very quickly, and in 3 days the local paper referred to his improved condition. The third day I began to treat the wife of a railroad man. I went to see her and found her in a dark room, as she was unable to bear the light. That evening she went outdoors. The next day she was much better, and in a very short time she was completely healed. A girl afflicted with a stiff arm came for help. After the first treatment, all pain disappeared, and in a few days the arm was straightened and she was able to resume her sewing. A case of tuberculosis, which had been given up by the doctors, was healed in a short time. A tumor was quickly healed.
Mary soon had all the cases she could handle, sometimes working night and day.
One case after another was healed, and the work went on, bringing comfort and healing to scores of needy ones.
Later in 1887, Mary and Willis married, and looking for a place to expand their work together, they soon moved to Wichita, Kansas. At Wichita, Mr. and Mrs. Gross worked as practitioners and joined a handful of local people to form a church. Willis was elected pastor. He gave Sunday sermons, conducted a weekly Bible school for adults as well as children, typical of Christian Science churches at the time, and he instructed classes in the fundamentals of Christian Science healing. In 1893, Willis taught a class which brings this particular chain of healing back to where we began. For among his students that year were 2 recent arrivals in Wichita, a strapping frontier farmer and his wife, who already had a history of Christian Science healing. It was the Hinchlifes, W.D. and his wife Bertha, who 5 years earlier had had a potential lynching at their backs as they treated young Jimmy King for typhoid fever. They had come a long way from the farm. In 1886, according to the reminiscence of his daughter Cora, William D. Hinchliffe had found himself unexpectedly selling door to door in Des Moines, Iowa. W.D. was new at salesmanship, and he was not having much luck at it. Until that year, W.D. had been a farmer in southern Kansas. With the opening of public land, he had paid the U.S. government $1 an acre for a quarter section and plowed the unbroken prairie fields himself. Cora Hinchliff recalled that other farmers nicknamed her father the strong man of the county. He could work more and lift more than anyone around. One day he hefted a giant fork load of hay and suddenly doubled over in pain. Doctors in town and in Wichita diagnosed it as the worst case of rupture they had ever seen. There was nothing they could do for him, but they recommended a new type of truss. Hinchliff gave it a try, and it seemed to help some, but he could no longer work the farm. He leased his land to another farmer and in desperation went to work as a salesman for the company that manufactured the truss he was wearing. His sales territory was in Iowa. After many unsuccessful weeks getting prospects but few sales, he went back to Des Moines to look up 6 prospects and find out why they had not purchased his product. 3 of them said they had been healed by a Christian Scientist. W.D. was appalled. He had once studied for the ministry and had heard nothing but evil about this new religion. As a last resort, he went to see the woman the 3 men called a Christian Science healer. Her treatment included turning Hinchliff's thought from hatred of a fellow landowner who had wronged him. Over several weeks, he was entirely healed of the hatred and the rupture. Those weeks transformed his way of thinking. The family returned to their farm and W.D. went back to working his fields. Neighbors were amazed at his recovery, and he began to get calls about Christian Science healing. A neighboring farmer sent word he had been diagnosed with consumption and given 3 months to live. W.D. told him they would work it out somehow through prayer and study of the Bible and science and health. In 3 months, as the man himself put it, he was out plowing the sod instead of being under it. Later, that neighbor's daughter showed symptoms of black diphtheria. An epidemic was sweeping through the region. The neighbor called W.D., and after several hours of prayer and study, the girl began to recover. Then a few days later, her brother became ill with the same indications. Again, they called on Hinchliff. While he was at the neighbor's, his wife Bertha sent him an urgent message to come home right away. Their own daughter, Cora, had come down with the symptoms. W.D. waited until he was sure the neighbor's boy was all right. Then he returned home. By then, Bertha was frantic. Many years later, Cora recalled the scene.
She was afraid he would be too late to save me. My father just gave me one glance and said to her, "What's the matter with you? Don't you know she can't die?" My mother gave a horrible scream, I can remember it yet, and went into hysterics. She knew she had a dying daughter and an insane husband. When he had quieted her a little, he turned to me and gave me some truth. Before her eyes, she saw me begin to get better. From that moment on, she was a devoted Christian Scientist. Cora Hinchliff Lindsay.
A few days later, Cora's little brother George came down with the same symptoms. But with W.D.'s immediate treatment, the boy soon recovered. Cora recalled that out of the dozens of children in Sumner County who came down with the disease that year, only she, her brother, and the 2 neighbors were saved. Then there was Mrs. King, wife of a veterinarian who suffered recurring bouts of illness. She was furiously opposed to Christian Science, but when she was laid low by another attack, her husband brought W.D. to treat her. Mrs. King angrily turned her face to the wall and refused to speak to either of them. Mr. King urged W.D. to pray for his wife anyway. He did, and then went home. Mrs. King fell off to sleep without taking her nightly dose of medicine. She woke up the next morning, healed. The Kings promptly took to studying Christian Science, which explains why, a year or so later, when their son Jimmy came down with typhoid fever, they sent for W.D. and his wife to heal him in the face of violent community protest.
Within a few years, W.D. and Bertha were handling so many cases they couldn't keep up with their farm work. They had to make a choice. The farm was sold, and they moved to town. In 1891, they moved again to Wichita, where they joined with the fledgling church and enrolled in a class taught by its pastor, Willis Gross, who just a few years earlier had studied in one of the pioneering classes taught by Janet Coleman. Our story has come full circle.
All the people in this circle of stories went on to fill important needs in establishing the Christian Science movement. The Hinchlifes worked with the Oklahoma legislature to protect the rights of Christian Scientists, and they and their children, Cora and George, continued their healing work well into the 20th century.
Willis and Mary Gross helped edit the Journal and Sentinel. Willis was president of the Mother Church in 1906 and became one of the early lecturers on Christian Science.
The Buswells moved to Concord, New Hampshire, where Ezra served as first reader of the Christian Science church Mrs. Eddy gave to her adopted hometown.
Joseph Armstrong became publisher of Mrs. Eddy's writings and was appointed to the first board of directors of her reorganized church, overseeing construction of the original Mother Church edifice. Mary Armstrong was a faithful helper to Mrs. Eddy's home at Concord. James Neal served as a trustee of the Publishing Society and later president and then a director of the Mother Church.
Alfred Farlow organized the Committee on Publication, working tirelessly to correct errors in the media about Christian Science and Mrs. Eddy. Alfred's brother Will, with a steady healing practice, settled in Los Angeles with his wife Ina to join in the rapid growth of Christian Science in California.
Throughout the busy careers of all these people, healing was at the center of their work. Alfred Farlow's healing practice was typical. When he retired in 1914 and prepared to join his brother and sister-in-law on the West Coast, Alfred packed letters from his patients over the years. His sister recalled the letters were pinned together in pairs, each letter asking for healing, pinned to a letter of thanks for the healing received. The letters filled a trunk. These were ordinary people who came from all walks of life. A bank president, a cashier, merchants, farmers, housewives, and mothers. They included college graduates and the self-taught, the prominent and the plain and simple. None more plain or more humble than Janet Coleman, who linked them all. In a letter, Janet told Mrs. Eddy how little she thought of herself.
I don't seem to make a very brilliant student, but my aim is to do as near right as I can and live up to what you have taught me.
As she had at the start, Janet continued to feel herself not good enough. Yet she was one of just 12 trusted students appointed by Mrs. Eddy to anchor the founding of the First Church of Christ Scientist. Janet Coleman had been a fisher of men who heard of a need in the West, asked if she should go, and at her leader's word, went. It's only fitting that the last word here should be hers, and that she should be recalling the teaching of her teacher.
Our leader told us, when fear came to us, to remember our past successes, to remember the many times that Christian Science has helped us stills fear, and what God has done once, He will do again.